There are places where the dead still reach for the sky, where silence hangs heavier than stone. In the mist-shrouded cliffs of southwest China, hundreds of wooden coffins cling to the rock, not buried beneath the earth, but suspended in air, as if refusing to descend. They rest where clouds gather, where wind hums through the bones of mountains. To the locals, they are the coffins of the sky. To archaeologists, they are the hanging coffins of the Bo people. But to those who have stood beneath them, they are something else entirely. A question carved in wood, floating between worlds. Who were these people who gave their dead to the wind? What kind of civilization looked at a sheer wall of stone and whispered, "This is where our souls will sleep"? And the most haunting mystery of all, not why they did it, but how they ever could. Sometimes, history reveals itself not through discovery, but through accident. In the mist-veiled mountains of Yunnan, during the 1940s, an American archaeologist named David Chet stumbled upon something that would haunt the study of ancient China for decades. He had been trekking through a narrow gorge, tracing what he believed were forgotten trade routes. The fog was thick enough to blur the world into watercolor. Stone, water, and silence merging into one. Then, a hollow sound broke the stillness. The deep, dry crack of wood meeting stone. At the base of a cliff lay the shattered remains of a coffin. The timber had split cleanly, its edges dark with centuries of rot. Inside, among the splinters, lay brittle shards of bone, a silver bracelet dulled by time, and a few threads of silk that shimmered faintly before vanishing into the damp air. When Chet looked upward, he froze. High above him, the cliff face opened like a cathedral wall. Dozens of wooden coffins were embedded into its sheer surface, some nestled into natural crevices, others balanced on beams driven directly into the stone. They seemed impossible, a graveyard suspended in midair, where gravity had surrendered to belief. No paths, no ladders, no scaffolds. Just coffins, hanging where no human hand should have reached. When Chet reported his find, local authorities and villagers led him deeper into the mountains. What he discovered next turned coincidence into revelation. The same sight repeated across Sichuan and Yunnan. Hundreds of coffins clinging to cliff sides, some barely above reach, others hundreds of feet high, where even eagles hesitated to fly. Each coffin was ancient yet astonishingly intact, their wooden grains sealed by resin and wind, as if the mountains themselves had conspired to preserve them. No signs of ritual grounds, no temple nearby, no written script to explain why. Just silence, old, deliberate, sacred. In his field journal, Chet wrote, "These coffins were not left to decay. They were placed to endure. Whoever built them did not fear death. They redefined it. To the scientific mind, it was a paradox. To the human heart, it was poetry. Why would a people lift their dead toward the sky instead of laying them into the earth? That single question, hanging as weightless as the coffins themselves, would open one of the most enduring enigmas of Asian archaeology. A mystery not buried beneath soil, but suspended between heaven and stone." For decades, the mystery of the hanging coffins remained suspended, literally and figuratively, in the silence of the mountains. No dynasty claimed them, no scripture mentioned them, no record bore the name of those who dared to raise their dead toward the sky. And yet, somewhere in the forgotten margins of ancient chronicles, a faint name survived: the Bo people. They were not an empire. They built no palaces, carved no stone tablets, left no written word to argue their place in history. What they left instead were the echoes of a mountain civilization, people who lived where the earth itself seemed unfinished. In the cliffs and misty ravines of Sichuan and Yunnan, the Bo thrived for centuries. They farmed terraces etched into rock, crafted delicate textiles, and carved their homes into the skin of the mountain. Their world was vertical, stone below, cloud above, and faith binding the two together. But isolation is both sanctuary and trap. When the Ming dynasty expanded south in the 15th century, roads, soldiers, and settlers poured into these lands. The lowlands rose, the mountains shrank, and the Bo, like the mist itself, retreated higher. Archaeologists now believe that this was when the custom of hanging coffins reached its peak. As their villages disappeared from the valleys, their graves began to climb the cliffs. It was not a coincidence, it was resistance. To lift their dead was to defy the world that had pushed them out. A statement carved not in stone, but in gravity. Old legends still breathe in these valleys. They speak of the children of the cliffs, men who could climb like shadows, whose hands clung to rock as if guided by the spirits of their ancestors. It is said that when someone died, the villagers carried the body at dawn into the fog, and by dusk, a new coffin would appear high above the valley, unreachable and unexplainable. Even now, locals speak of faint drums echoing in the mist, as if the mountains remembered the rhythm of those funerals. But history is not kind to those who live beyond its borders. By the late 1500s, the Bo were gone, erased from records with a single phrase in imperial logs: pacified tribe. Their name faded, their villages vanished, and the winds carried away their language. All that remained were their coffins, wooden signatures of a people who refused to be buried. And yet, traces linger. Genetic studies hint at their descendants among the Yi and other mountain tribes. Their hairstyles, their ritual songs, even the way some describe the journey of the soul as an ascent through cloud and stone, mirror what the coffins themselves proclaim. It is as though the Bo never truly left. They simply changed form, becoming part of the landscape, part of the faith that still whispers through bamboo and rock. When I stood at the edge of one of their ancient valleys, the air felt heavier, older, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. In that silence, I could almost hear them, the sound of wood against stone, rope against skin, the heartbeat of a people trying to lift memory above oblivion. The Bo believed death was not descent, but continuation. And perhaps that is why, when their world began to crumble, they raised their dead to the only place that empire could not reach. The question is not only who they were, but what truth they tried to leave behind, hanging between heaven and time. For centuries, the coffins hung in silence, wooden shadows clinging to cliffs, untouched by hand or time. And yet, silence never lasts forever. Eventually, someone always dares to listen. In the 1970s, a team of Chinese archaeologists began their ascent. I still remember reading the expedition notes: bamboo scaffolds trembling in the wind, men suspended by ropes, dust rising like smoke each time their hammers touched the rock. It wasn't just a dig, it was a conversation with ghosts. When they reached the first coffin, the wood was smooth as stone. Nanmu, the sacred hardwood used for imperial temples, its surface darkened by centuries of rain and breath. The coffin was carved from a single tree, its lid sealed so precisely that even the mountain's humidity could not pry it open. Inside, time unfolded like a whisper. Layers of silk and linen, pressed flat by the centuries, wrapped around bones delicate as glass. Beneath them, bronze mirrors reflected the faces of the living who looked in. Jade bracelets, combs, flutes of carved bone. Small, fragile things, but alive with meaning. Some coffins were nearly empty, just rough hemp cloth and simple clay pots. Others were lavish, filled with treasures, as if the dead had carried their status into eternity. Even here, Between heaven and earth, hierarchy survived. But what struck researchers most was not the wealth, it was the intention. Everything was arranged with care, precision, love. The wood still smelled faintly of resin. The silk shimmered under lamplight, still holding color after 1,000 years. It was as though whoever had placed them here believed that the afterlife deserved beauty, not sorrow. On the rock walls nearby, faint traces of red pigment told another story. Hunters, dancers, riders on horseback. No mourning, no death. Only motion. Only life continuing somewhere unseen. And that was when one of the researchers wrote a single line in his journal. They did not bury the dead. They sent them on their way. Carbon dating later revealed the unthinkable. Some coffins were as young as 400 years old. Others had been hanging there for more than 2.5 millennia. Generation after generation, the same craft, the same faith, passed down through centuries of reign and empire. How does a tradition survive longer than the civilization that made it? Perhaps because it was never just a ritual, it was a declaration. Every mark of the chisel, every grain of non-mu wood, carried a truth the bow understood, that craftsmanship could be a kind of prayer. Even the way they built defied time. The lids were locked by wooden pegs that expanded with humidity, tightening as the years grew heavy. Fire was used to hollow the trunks. Fire, the element of change, turned into a tool of preservation. It was science guided by reverence. Standing beneath one of these coffins today, you can almost feel its heartbeat. It's faint, but real. The scent of aged resin still lingers. The wood hums in the wind like a distant drum. This was not architecture. It was belief, engineered. And maybe that's what makes it so haunting. The realization that the bow built something stronger than monuments. They built memory itself. Because wood rots, mountains crumble. But faith, once carved deep enough, learns how to hold on. So we are left with a question that refuses to fade. What truth did they bury inside that wood? And why does it still refuse to fall? Every civilization writes its philosophy of death. Some reach downward, burying their dead in the quiet patience of soil. Others reach upward, raising stone spires to touch the sun. But the bow did something entirely different. They chose the air. When you stand beneath those cliffs, the first thing you feel is the wind. It doesn't move around you. It moves through you. It's the same wind that has touched those coffins for more than 1,000 years, polishing the wood smooth, humming softly in the seams. It's as if the mountains are breathing, and the coffins are the lungs. Archaeologists once called these graves acts of survival, a way to keep animals or floods away. But standing there, you know that explanation feels too small. This was not fear, it was faith. The bow placed their dead where sky and stone meet, not to hide them, but to let them belong. Wind became breath, rain became cleansing, sunlight became passage. To the bow, the mountain wasn't an obstacle, it was a bridge. Old Yi legends still speak of them, the children of the cliffs who believed the soul was light, but its journey was heavy. And so, they built ladders of wood and air, one coffin at a time, giving their ancestors a place to rest halfway to heaven. I remember looking up once, tracing the outline of a coffin barely visible through fog. The wood glowed faintly in the diffused light, like an ember that refused to die. For a moment, I didn't feel like I was looking at death. I felt like I was looking at persistence, the human refusal to vanish quietly. The bow never built temples. They didn't need to. The mountain was their temple, the sky, their altar. They turned the landscape into scripture, carving their belief into the bones of the earth. Each coffin became a verse, each cliff a page, Each gust of wind, a prayer whispered in an eternal language. And perhaps that's why, even after their culture disappeared, their message did not. That remembrance is not measured by stone or name, but by how long a soul can echo against the sky. They remind us that faith doesn't always rise in temples or words. Sometimes it hangs, silent, weightless, between earth and heaven, where time forgets to erase it. Did the bow build graves or gateways? I still remember the first time I stood beneath those cliffs in Yunnan. The coffins above were barely visible through the mist, dark silhouettes etched against the pale stone, swaying ever so slightly in the wind. Even from the valley floor, I could hear it, the low creak of ancient wood. It sounded alive. And in that sound lived the question that has haunted archaeologists for decades. How? Did they do it? No tools, no records, no written instructions, just timber, stone, and faith. And yet, hundreds of these coffins still hang today, untouched, unmoved, unfallen. The earliest explanations were comforting in their simplicity. Some believed the rivers once flowed higher, that boats carried the coffins directly to the cliffs when the mountains were half drowned. But geology denied it. The rock told a different story, one of patience, not flood. The water never climbed that high. Then came the engineers. They imagined forests of scaffolding, bamboo towers stretching skyward, layer upon layer. But when modern teams tried to replicate it, the numbers betrayed them. Even with steel and modern tools, it would take months to build what would have lasted only hours. The bow could not afford time. Their funerals, guided by ritual, demanded speed. So the scholars looked higher, literally. What if, they asked, the bow didn't climb up to their graves, but down to them? That theory changed everything. Along the vertical faces of these mountains, archaeologists discovered small, evenly spaced holes descending in a straight line. Inside a few of them, decayed fragments of wooden pegs remained, fingerprints of an ancient engineering feat. The idea was radical, but beautiful in its simplicity. The bow had worked from the top down. Ropes woven from vine, stakes burned and hardened by fire, human chains lowering the dead with reverent precision. It must have been terrifying. The cliffs rise more than 100 meters. One slip would mean instant death. And yet, they did it, again and again, for centuries. Standing there, I tried to imagine it. A small group of men clinging to the rock, a coffin swaying below them, ropes groaning under the weight. The valley echoing with the ring of wood on stone. Each impact, each breath, each heartbeat, synchronized with belief. They weren't defying nature. They were negotiating with it. Some coffins, however, refused to fit this explanation. Hidden deep within narrow caves or wedged under impossible overhangs, they defy every model of logic. How could anyone have placed them there? Did the bow carve the cliffs themselves, shaping them to cradle their dead? Did they build temporary platforms, wooden bridges that vanished when the ritual was complete? Or did they know something about balance, wind, and the weight of wood that we've simply forgotten? Every answer we give collapses under its own certainty. For every theory, the mountains whisper another question. And perhaps that's what makes this mystery endure. Because even when the science is sound, there's a silence we can't explain. The silence that follows when the last craftsman cuts the rope and the coffin swings freely for the first time, finding its place in the wind. Maybe that's when gravity learned to respect them. Maybe that's when the earth itself agreed to remember. There are places on this planet where silence has memory, where the air itself remembers every breath, every prayer, every name that once echoed between stone and sky. The cliffs of Sichuan and Yunnan are one of them. When I stood there, beneath the hanging coffins, the world seemed to pause. No sound of machines, no trace of modern time. Only the wind, soft, rhythmic, moving through centuries as if it still carried their voices. The bow may have vanished, but they are not gone. They live in the patience of these cliffs, in the texture of every chisel mark, in the way the wood hums when the wind passes through it. They didn't build to outlast time. They built to speak through it. Every plank, every thread of silk, every grain of Nanmu wood is a sentence in a language carved before words existed. A language of devotion, of courage, of the refusal to vanish quietly. Scientists came searching for explanations, measurements, materials, radiocarbon dates. But what they found was something no carbon test could measure: endurance. Because endurance is its own kind of immortality. Maybe that's what the bow understood. That to live forever, you don't need empires. You just need something the wind will remember. Centuries have passed. Empires have risen, crumbled, and faded into textbooks. Yet those coffins remain, still there, still suspended, still untouched by everything we call progress. Sometimes when the fog drifts low, they almost look weightless, floating, glowing faintly in the moonlight, like a constellation of the forgotten. Locals say the spirits of the bow still walk the ridges, whispering through the bamboo and rain. Scientists call it sound refraction. But the heart knows it's something else. Maybe that's not echo. Maybe that's memory. Every civilization believes it knows how to honor the dead. But the bow did something more. They taught us how to remember the living. Because when you stand beneath those cliffs long enough, you begin to realize they're not just hanging above us, they're hanging within us. And perhaps that's the real secret. When I first saw the hanging coffins of the bow, I thought they were unique, a miracle sealed within one culture, one mountain, one time. But the more I traveled, the more I realized the sky has many graves. Thousands of miles away, in the misty highlands of Sagada in the Philippines, I stood before another cliff that looked hauntingly familiar. Wooden coffins, smaller, lighter, but lifted high above the valley, balanced on stone shelves carved into the mountain itself. Locals told me their ancestors placed the dead close to the sky because the soul climbs faster when it starts higher. The words were different. The faith was not. In Indonesia, among the Toraja people, I saw cliffs that looked almost alive. Hundreds of small doorways opened into rock, each guarding the remains of the departed. Wooden guardians, Tao Tao, stood at attention, their eyes fixed on the horizon. When the wind blew, their shadows danced, like echoes of the people they were carved to protect. And in northern Vietnam, deep within the limestone folds of Thanh Hoa and Son La, archaeologists uncovered the same pattern again. Wooden coffins resting on beams above rivers, hidden in mountains where sunlight rarely reaches. Villagers say they were left by the Sky People, who vanished long before the first dynasties rose. At first glance, these sites seem isolated, separated by oceans, languages, and time. But step back far enough, and a pattern begins to emerge, like constellations across the map of Asia. Wood, stone, height. The same trinity appears again and again, whispering the same message. Lift the body, free the soul, honor the climb. Some anthropologists believe this is coincidence, a natural solution born from geography and gravity. But others suspect something deeper, a forgotten network of migration stretching across the mountains and islands of ancient Asia. Recent genetic studies show faint traces of shared ancestry, threads of DNA linking China's southwest to Southeast Asia and the Pacific. If trade and blood once flowed along those routes, why not belief? Perhaps the idea of raising the dead came from one ancestral source, a spiritual seed scattered by time, carried by travelers, sailors, and dreamers who saw the sky not as distance, but as destination. And when I look at these sites, Bo, Sagada, Toraja, Sanla, I can't help but imagine one long, invisible breath connecting them, like a single civilization speaking in many tongues. Like a choir that forgot its song, but still remembers the rhythm. Maybe the Bo didn't invent the hanging coffins. Maybe they were the last guardians of a truth that once stretched across the world. A truth about how to let go without falling. Because when we forget, the mountains remember. And in the hum of wind across wood, in the stillness between echoes, you can almost hear them all. Bo, Toraja, Sagada, Sanla, whispering the same question through the centuries. What if this was never about death at all, but about connection? In the end, the mountains remain. Silent, patient, watching. We've measured the cliffs, dated the coffins, traced the migrations. We know the numbers. We know the data, but we still don't know the silence. Science tells us how they did it. Faith whispers. Why? And between those two answers lies the truth we still don't understand. Every culture builds its own version of eternity. For the Bo, it was wood and air. For us, it's memory and curiosity. We're not so different. We're all trying to keep something from disappearing. When I return to that valley in Yunnan, I always look up at the cliffs. The coffins are still there, weathered, darkened by centuries, yet unbroken. Moonlight touches them like a slow heartbeat. In that glow, they almost look alive, like the eyes of ancestors, watching us try to explain them. And I realize then, science can illuminate the world, but mystery gives it meaning. Maybe the Bo never wanted to be understood. Maybe they wanted to be remembered. The coffins, the cliffs, the wind, they're all still speaking, in a language older than time itself. Not to tell us what they knew, but to remind us what we've forgotten, that wonder is sacred, that questions are holy. So perhaps the real mystery is not in the cliffs, not in the coffins, but in us, in why we still look up and listen and search. Because maybe the mountain has already answered, not in words, but in endurance. And if you stand there long enough, you'll hear it too. The faint hum between wind and stone, whispering one final truth. The question was never waiting for an answer. It was the answer. And so, as the wind fades and the mountains return to their silence, we are left with more than a mystery. We are left with a mirror, reflecting what we all search for, somewhere between earth and sky. The hanging coffins are not just relics of a forgotten tribe. They are reminders that time can erase names, but never wonder. And maybe that's why we keep coming back, to stories like this, to the places where history still breathes beneath the dust, and where mystery never truly dies. If this journey moved you, if, for even a moment, you felt the wind of those mountains whisper something ancient, then stay with us. Share this story, add your voice to the echoes below, and help us uncover the next secret waiting in the shadows of time. Because every question you ask, every thought you leave in the comments, every story you share keeps history alive. And somewhere out there, beneath another forgotten cliff, the next mystery is already waiting. This is Chronicle of Secrets, where history breathes and mystery never dies.